Hi, Jay. Welcome.
Hi,
We
thank
were
you.
just talking a little bit about the weather, and you guys got some snow. So did everything shut down?
No, no, no. It's, New Mexico has a little bit of snow equipment here, but it was just an odd one because it snowed, I think it was Thursday morning, quite a bit, actually about 4 inches. But then by the afternoon, the sun had come out, and by the evening, it looked like it had never snowed at all. So it's
Huh.
kind of our typical snow here in New Mexico.
All right. When on my most recent trip there, it snowed about 3 inches, and a lot of things were closed. I had a hard time finding a restaurant that was open.
Oh, you're kidding. Wow.
I was surprised. Of course, we have a lot more equipment to deal with snow here. So,
Oh yeah,
all right.
and this is the desert, so we don't get as much snow down here in the valley. It's in the mountains. At high elevation usually is where most of the snow falls here.
Yeah, I would have thought that they could have handled the snow a little bit more up there, but oh well.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for whoever's joining us. This is Voices in the Wilderness. We're a show on faith and science that addresses questions by sex skeptics and Christians who are wondering how to fit science and faith together, and how does the Bible all fit into that. If you're watching and you have questions, you could put your questions in the comment section of the YouTube video or on Facebook, and if we have time, we'll try to get to some of your questions. And let me introduce Jay for you all. Jay Johnson spent 15 years as a magazine editor and publisher before embarking on a second career teaching English in the juvenile justice system. After he quit teaching full-time in 2016, he began researching the connection between young earth creationism and the loss of faith among younger generations. Jay has written about evolution, original sin, and Adam and Eve for the Canadian American Theological Review, BioLogos, the Lutheran Coalition of Faith, Science and Technology, and God and Nature magazine, and for his website, becomingadam.com. And as far as we know, we're not related, at least not for many generations back. So welcome, Jay. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
Maybe you could start out just by sharing a little bit about your background and how did you, as an English teacher, start thinking about science and faith, and what was your family of origin like? How did you guys integrate faith and science growing up, or was that ever something you talked about? Just let us know about your background.
Well, I grew up in the Texas Panhandle in the Methodist church. Um, we didn't really have an issue with science and faith in my house. I mean, I personally, as a kid, would just divorce myself from the things that I didn't understand, like Noah's Ark. Um, I've been to the zoo, and I couldn't imagine all these animals fitting on an ark. And so whenever the story came up in Sunday school, I would just kind of ignore it. As far as the science and faith question goes, I I was not one who was taught that there's only one way to interpret the Bible, and it's either all literal or all untrue. So I didn't have to cross that bridge that a lot of other people have had to cross in their lifetime of trying to reconcile those things. How my interest in this subject got started is a roundabout story. Really, it was I was teaching a Bible study, a prison Bible study, and I looked around one day, and I had about 20, 30 guys in the group, but I suddenly realized that even though the prison population was, you know, around 22 years old on average, um, pretty much everybody in my group was over the age of 30. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, well, if these guys won't come to me, then I find a way to get to them. And that's was sort of the impetus for, my change of careers when I and became a teacher in juvenile detention, kind of my way of reaching the kids. But, is during that time, say, the 2000s, 2012 or so, I was, my own kids were growing up, my own kids were teenagers, and, among their friends and among the kids I taught, the younger generation just was walking away from the faith in a lot of cases, and they were struggling. And so, long story, moved here to New Mexico, and I was teaching here, teaching special ed. But when I quit doing that, I really wanted to do a book. I had in mind doing a book about the loss of faith among the younger generation. And when I started searching the causes, one of the great causes that came up in Dave Kinnaman's book, You Lost Me, one of the causes that really caught my eye was so many younger people losing faith because of science questions and evolutionary questions and things like that. So I didn't doubt the scientific facts of evolution, but personally, I'd never been motivated to try to integrate that together with my own Christian faith. I started looking for some resources, and that's how I wound up at BioLogos and working with them there. Eventually, I was a volunteer with them for a little while, mainly moderating discussions. But that was the impetus. That was the start of my journey towards, discovering this science and faith question and how now we have a word for it in deconstruction. At the time that I was looking into it, that wasn't a common term. It was just, people are walking away from the church, and that was the start of it for me.
Glad to join you. I just wanted to let you know we are up on Facebook and on YouTube. So if anyone would like to jump in with a question, we'll try and fit you in. Although we do have a time constraint, and we've got a lot of questions for Jay on our own. I think just to follow up on Kristine's question, Jay, you write a lot about Adam. It seems to be on your mind, and not only in some of the columns you've shared, but also on a podcast and so forth. So how my question is, how did you end up stuck on Adam? And I'm going to try and tee you up by saying this. When you mention deconstruction, what happens a lot in evangelical circles is when people are finally confronted with their faith upbringing that might have suggested that the opening chapters of Genesis are literal in some way. Whether it's a young earth or an old earth, there was a real, Adam and Eve, and they're necessary and so forth. And then they might come into an engagement with modern science, and they feel that evolutionary biology and deep time is a challenge to what their upbringing was. And some believers crumble in a crisis of faith. Others are excited, and they feel liberated, and they're excited that there was this corner of the world that they had dismissed out of hand that now opens up their mind to really the beauty of how things actually work, in not just in biology, but in geology and astronomy and other places. But then they say, uh-oh, when they think, wait a minute, didn't Jesus talk about Adam and Eve, and didn't Paul, put a lot of emphasis on the first Adam, and Jesus is the last Adam? So how do I make sense of Adam and Eve in an evolutionary context now? And so I'm not going to answer for you, but is that kind of collision what got you interested in your becoming Adam, becomingadam.com, and that kind of sense of urgency?
Um, the focus on Adam really comes from my own background too. Is I grew up evangelical, and I have some problems with the label these days, but I guess I would still claim it. But in evangelical thought, and especially when you start throwing in things like inerrancy, um, granted that there was a literal Adam and Eve, and I think a lot of people also feel the same way. So how does that work with evolution, and how does that fit together? So the starting point for me was really not trying to start with humans or the New Testament. It really was what does Genesis itself say? Going back to the text of Genesis 1 through 3 and looking at it. And I think any honest thinking person who looks at it and isn't locked into a certain ideological framework can look at it and say, well, this is not quite what I thought it was, because Adam isn't named in Genesis 2. It's Ha-Adam, the man, and Eve isn't named in Genesis 2 and 3. It's Ha-Isa, the woman. So from there, and you look at the text, and with an open mind, there's a lot of room, I think, in there that not just makes and a population of people coming through evolution versus special creation of two individuals who were the very first humans and that all humans came from. And especially when you start to look into the science of it, because populations, a new species doesn't come out of just two breeding individuals. A breeding couple doesn't start a species. We came from a population. That was where I had to start, was going back to the text of Genesis itself at that, and seeing things that indicated really a process and not a poof. Does that make sense?
Well, to me it might. To some of our listeners who are still in evangelical circles, I think, particularly my own upbringing, I was kind of introduced to the Genesis story as narrative history, as something that actually happened. And so I wasn't really confronted about that till later in life. So hearing now suggested that Adam and Eve might not be literal, or that Genesis might be more of a theological or a polemic even text than something that actually carries what happened, is challenging. Growing up in that kind of culture warrior Christianity that I grew up in, Jay, the idea is evolution was evil. And so I know you casually mention it as a scientific theory, but growing up we were taught kind of that God created this near perfect, if not absolutely perfect, universe, and he called it very good, and that this fall, this rebellion between the first couple, led to everything nasty, from thorns to death to
Mosquitoes.
mosquitoes, sexual hedonism, predation with the animal world. I mean, the lamb did lie down with the lion until Eve and Adam ate of the fruit, and then all things. Pandora's box was shattered when Eve ate of the fruit. And long ages, people lived really long time back then, shrunk down to our ages. And so you kind of got the impression that things were perfect, and they've been on a downward spiral since Adam. Adam probably spoke 11 languages, had perfect health, and a great tan. He certainly wasn't follically impaired as 2 out of 3 of us are.
No.
And Eve was the perfect woman, and everything just, you see the chaos building from chapter 3 forward. But then evolution tells a very different story. I mean, it tells a story of really infantile hominins, over time, all coming into a place where Homo sapiens go through a cognitive explosion, if you would, and we happen to now not just look at the moon and howl, but actually be able to land technology there and explore the universe. So you seem to have one graph that's going down, and that we'll call God's graph, and then we have Darwin's graph that seems to be going up, and then you come along saying these things aren't necessarily incompatible. So for those of our viewers who grew up like I did, thinking that evolution isn't just a theory of biology, but is something that led to the Holocaust and sexual perversion and abortion and all that, I don't know that it makes sense. I mean, there's these words that are scary for people in that world, and one of them is Darwin, one of them is evolution. And you still have these Christian groups that are basically backing that up. The creationism groups basically saying that, yeah, amen, that's true. So now in your background, you say you didn't have a problem as much with creation and faith, but you did kind of dismiss early on the idea that Noah's Ark was a factual story.
Right.
To believers who are just grappling with this idea, that how do you explain? I guess this is my precise question. How do you explain the fall from an evolutionary perspective, and how do you explain modern science from the Genesis perspective?
The fall from an evolutionary perspective. Well, it's really pretty straightforward. And if you look at human evolution, and especially morality, and I'm a fan of Jonathan Haidt's writing in that regard, but the direction it's going is really something like that. The way to picture it is as humans, sitting here where we are now. How did we get here? How do we transition from animal to the fall? Humans who are able to reason abstractly and about things like morality, and so if you look at it as a program, an animal-like state where they do things that we would, as humans, would call evil, but we don't condemn them for it. We don't look at it as, well, my dog was evil to chew up the bed. That's not something that would occur to us, or to steal or to kill. So how do we transition from that point of just being morally ignorant? You could call that innocent, because like Kierkegaard said, innocence really is ignorance. So the innocence of Adam and Eve, or in my terms, the man and the woman who represent both, they're an archetype, they represent both the human and every one of us as individuals. So we made that transition too, as a group, as humanity. We had to move from a place of ignorance to a place of knowledge of good and evil. And the path, it really has to follow language evolution.
Let me jump in here because we've never really given you an opportunity to express your opinion on Adam and Eve. And if people haven't read your work, they don't know. But you just used the word archetypal.
Right.
So maybe you can give us just a short definition of what you think of Adam and Eve. Were they real people? What do you mean by archetypal? What does that make Genesis?
Well, an archetype is, by the literary definition, an archetype is a symbol that represents a universal experience or a universal pattern in human life, in nature, if you will. So to say that it's really just to recognize that the personal names, Adam and Eve, don't appear in the narrative of Genesis 2 and 3. The name Adam doesn't even appear till Genesis 5, right at the beginning. So the characters in the story are not a person named Adam or a person named Eve. They're symbols that stand for humanity in general. That's what the word Adam means in Hebrew, is human. And when you attach the definite article to it, the in English, and say the Adam, you're saying something like the human or the man. You're not talking about an individual. So right there at the start, it's not about one man or one woman and their failure. It's really about the human journey of a transition from ignorance to moral maturity, moral knowledge. Let's see, did I answer your question?
You did, but I know that, and recently we've seen some blowback on pages that we're all involved in that handle these kind of questions from particularly young Earth creationists, but some old Earth creationists, which would say that they're going to bring up Jesus, and they're going to say, listen, Jesus talked about Adam and Eve, and so I guess the question, yes, but in this particular sense, Jesus, because Jesus was more than Paul, and so I think that they would ask you at this point, when Jesus mentions Adam and Eve and what it was like and their marriage and so forth, did Jesus know that they were an archetype, or did Jesus believe they were a real couple? And if Jesus was wrong, is that what you're trying to say, that the Son of God was wrong and we should listen to you and Richard Dawkins and not to Jesus and Ken Ham?
I think I had the same conversation this week already.
Did you? Oh no.
Well, then I'll pose that for both of you. You could both take a swing at that. I think I've been fair with that conversation, though.
No, that's a pretty common.
Well, did you want to go first, Kristine, or me?
Oh, why don't you go ahead? You go for it.
I'll take a crack at it, and then you can correct me. My answer to that, to begin with, is Jesus doesn't mention Adam and Eve, and I can't climb inside Jesus' head and say this is what he didn't know. So the passage there, when he mentions really Genesis 2 there at the end, to reference marriage. Even if you look at Genesis 2, that particular text, that particular passage comes after it's almost like an add-on, really. It's an editorial comment that's saying, that is thrown in afterwards to say, that to give a judge. Um, Jesus doesn't talk about Adam. He references, Genesis 2 in regard to marriage. He doesn't talk about Adam. That's my answer.
And I would say too, one of the important hermeneutical principles when looking at the Bible is, at least from a conservative way of reading the Bible, is that we look at the context and the culture and the language and what was the original intent of that particular conversation. And it is a conversation about marriage, right? It's about the purpose of marriage and God's intention for marriage. So it would be, I would say it would be a liberal idea to divorce the context here and try to apply it to how long was each day of creation and how long ago did that occur, because that wasn't the context of that conversation. So if one wishes to do that, it is, I would say, stepping outside of the inspired text as it was written to make that claim. So I would call that a liberal.
Would you both agree, though, that this is the real sticking point with people who have made the Bible their authority in this case, and they understand a more literal sense? Would you both agree that it's not really Genesis? It's Jesus and Paul, who seem at least to allude to a more literal.
I would say, that's definitely one of the drivers for why people want to hold on to the particular way they're reading those passages. But again, I would say that's not just literal, but liberal, in that it's kind of not considering the context of those passages. Maybe more so with Jesus's comment than Paul's. Paul's is maybe a little bit more. It could be that he actually believed in a literal Adam and Eve, but I don't know that an archetypal reading of that passage does it disservice either.
So
no, and I would point out that even Paul, like in Romans 1, there's several evangelical interpreters who view what Paul said as his version of the fall. And in that passage, I'm talking about 18 to 25, but in that passage, he's not talking about a particular individual. He's going, but he goes back to creation and says, since the creation, people have looked around and been able to, understand God's divine power and attributes. And so they're without excuse. And the picture he draws of kind of one of God abandoning humanity and leaving us to our own devices. So we, promptly turn to idolatry and evil. So, if you look at it that way, you could almost say, well, sometimes Paul uses Adam, sometimes Paul speaks of the fall in general terms as involving all of humanity, and not just Paul alone. I mean, not just Adam alone being, a sole problem who sinned and led us all down this path. I just don't like blaming it all on one guy,
Well, especially a guy who, it seems like those who hold this perspective also tend to elevate Adam to almost this Superman hero person who was perfect and sinless and able to name 50,000 different animals in the afternoon and
Monday
and live in this perfect paradise where he didn't even have to weed thorns and thistles, and all was well, and he had this pretty much perfect wife that was made just for him. And his situation looks
That's how
really
it always
different.
works, though, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that's my life. I don't know about you. Not much. It just seems like the way Adam is presented as a really different person that's not very much like all of us. And the way Scripture talks about sin is about, this is all of our stories. This is the story of Israel,
Right.
Constantly abandoning their God for the idols of the nations around them. And this is our life too, where we constantly put ahead of God our own idols, whatever they may be. So talk a little bit about this view where Adam is so perfect and how that maybe doesn't fit well with, this big picture message of the Bible.
Yeah, it really doesn't. Especially if you want to look at it, say from the perspective of covenant theology, Reformed theology, where they view Adam as a representative who represented all of us there. And the problem that you have with that, it's something that Kierkegaard pointed out in his essay, his book on the concept of anxiety. But how exactly does a perfect Adam in a perfect environment, well, perfect Adam and Eve in a perfect environment with no temptations, no sins, no knowledge of any of that stuff, how did they fall? How would it even occur to them to disobey? And more importantly, how does such a figure represent me or represent any other human being in the world now? So this perfect man in a perfect environment somehow represented all of us, and his failure is my failure and your failure. And it's a story that really doesn't add up, because if somebody is to represent us, then they should, just like Christ, they should be subject to temptation like we were, and grew up in a normal family, grew up in a normal small town, brothers and sisters, that the whole shebang that goes with it. So it's easy to say that Christ represented all of us in his struggle with sin and his life of obedience to God. But how does Adam represent any of us in that sense? He, as far as the normal picture, the usual picture of Adam goes, I don't see any connection to actual human life or reality, even.
Quick question from a viewer, Mr. Lizard. Do you think Adam and Eve? Do you think Adam and Eve could be two literal people, but that not actually being their names? Well, Adam and Eve come out of a group of humans known as the pre-Adamites. And that leads us into a question. Maybe you can take that question and wrap it up into one about a popular book that came out recently about the genealogical Adam and Eve, written by Dr. Joshua Swamidass. An idea that, as somebody once quipped, you can have your evolution and your Eden too. Have your cake and your Eden too. The idea that outside of the garden, evolutionary biology and deep time and all that was taking place, modern science was taking place, but God specially created two individuals 6,000 years ago who are genealogically related to us all, and that kind of solves the problem that you're suggesting Adam and Eve being an archetype are. So not wanting to dismiss Mr. Lizard, but he kind of brought us into this area. Can you take a swing at both of those?
Yeah. Sure. The first question again was
Is it possible that
whether they
Adam
were
and
people.
Eve were literal people that were, elected by God out of a pre-Adamite, say, hominin group or early Homo sapien group?
Sure, that's always and there are some who hold that idea, um, like John Walton or John Stott, I believe. But it's possible, but you got to jump through a lot of hoops to do it. Like for instance, okay, if there was already a population of Homo sapiens, of humans, um, fully human like we are, but yet not well, they hadn't sinned in some way. So the problem you've got to try to deal with is, um, if God selected this Adam and Eve for presumably a test, then they're they're selected out of a population of people. And at what point did he select them? I mean, were they children? Were they infants? Because if they were already fully grown adults, then I have a hard time seeing how they could be called innocent or ignorant of sin at all. Um, that part just doesn't make any sense. The other problem is really just like if God specially created two people, Adam and Eve, and placed them in a garden, and there's a population outside the garden of people who came about by evolution. Um, if God specially created Adam and Eve and placed them in this garden, well, how did Adam learn to speak? First of all, uh, speech is something that language is something that you have to learn by doing, practice, and the only way that you could get around that would be God would have had to have implanted memories in Adam and Eve's mind of how to speak. And once you start getting into things like God implanting memories in people's minds, you're getting into real problematic territory. That's not much different than God planting false evidence of an old earth. That's the one problem with it. The other problem is you start to get into, okay, if God selected Adam and Eve out of an existing population, he almost would have had to wipe their memories from any kind of knowledge of good and evil so that they could have a fresh start. And again, that's problematic. And then they get cast out of the garden, and if there's already people outside the garden, they join society, and they would know nothing. I mean, like I put it in one article I wrote, how would Adam know not to people or take other people's things? It doesn't make sense. He wouldn't have been socialized. He wouldn't know the rules of society. I mean, I could see him dying of stupidity in pretty short order. Because if you have two people who've never been civilized and don't understand the rules of society because they've never lived in society, they've only lived in a garden with the two of them, and once in a while, it kind of just falls apart for me. So
I think the
I know it's
critics,
possible, and
I think the critics might say they had a pretty good tutor if they walked with God in the eve of the night, though.
yeah, but how?
Yeah.
You're turning God into a nursemaid. No,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
God, God,
Okay.
God
So
would have had
there's
a.
another. Okay, there's this
Go
other
ahead.
kind of popular book right now that has putting Adam and Eve way back, hundreds of thousands of years ago, not even being a Homo sapien, but a Heidelberg how do you say it?
Heidelbergensis.
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 Yeah.
Um, so okay, to me, when I read that, I thought, well, that doesn't sound like the kind of text that this is writing, where we already have agriculture and irrigation, and it seems much more. Um, it seems very disconnected from the biblical text. So, what are your thoughts on that idea where Adam and Eve are like, 200-300,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago?
Yeah, I think 750,000 years ago was where William Lane Craig wanted to put him in his book about Adam. Um, yeah, excuse me. I respect the fact that William Lane Craig did try to uh, follow out the evidence to where it led him. And in his search for Adam and Eve, he was trying to look at things that would be necessary for humanity to fulfill or to be in the image of God. And he settled on a lot of the things like symbolism and abstraction and stuff like that. So he followed out the evidence 750,000 years ago, and he's in the right neighborhood as far as what I would call the beginnings of being truly human. So I would push it back to probably more like a million. But what you're looking at is Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis, and this related to language and related to symbolism. And the problem with William Craig's conception, yes, the very very beginnings of language showed up around then, but there's a huge difference between the first appearance of something and its full blown into maturity. So the things that he points towards say those are human traits, but that's not much different than saying an infant is born in the image of God, but they don't yet know how to speak. They don't have any concept of metaphor or symbolism. They don't have any even concept of God at that point. All those things are learned, and as their brains and bodies develop, they mature and they acquire those capabilities. So for myself, I would say Craig is right in that I would call those people human, but I would compare them to infants or toddlers who it's just the tiniest little beginning of things. And if you try to locate Adam there, that's where William Lane Craig really jumps the shark, is because he has to resort to something like, well, God specially charged up their brain and language abilities and specially gave it to them, and that spread to other people, and yeah, doesn't work.
Well, since I've been kind of taking the position of a young earth creationist or a creationist in my questions towards you in regard to what you've just said, I'm going to flip the script and take a position of a non-believer who happens to be fine accepting world history and evolutionary biology. And I'm going to say, when I keep hearing about this idea of a fall, I don't see it. And if you look at evolutionary psychology, or people who've written, the author who wrote The Faith Instinct, for example, anthropologists who look at these old civilizations that you and Kristine just brought up, you don't see a fall away from an advanced religion. You see archaic religion that's built around music and drums and chanting, and it grows. And as language increases, as you say, language becomes more important to these religions. And from a kind of a spiral dynamics point of view, we don't see a fall at all. We see a climb. We see religions all becoming more refined. And the Old Testament was kind of a blood religion with sacrifice. And when they were agricultural, there were meal offerings. And we've moved away from that in all around the globe. So how do you as a Christian try and explain to somebody from that perspective what you mean by the fall?
Well, what I mean by the fall is this moral maturity, the acquisition of this knowledge of good and evil. And I think I started to describe it earlier and I got sidetracked. So I'll try to come back to that and explain my concept of the fall again, which is really just, it is inevitable and also logical in the sense that humans had to progress from that animal-like state that I talked about earlier, one of where we find ourselves now. The path that it went through was language and symbolism, but it also involved cooperation and things like altruism, and use of that type of stuff in the animal world, but we supercharged it. So in one sense, you could say that, since I view God as guiding evolution, and then I see God bringing us along in cooperation and in lessened aggression, because when a chimpanzee, for instance, runs into a strange edge of its territory, there's either going to be a confrontation or a display of aggression or something to drive that. So, but in humans, what you start to see about 1 million years ago is trade networks suddenly appear, meaning that the that is used to create a tool no longer just is found in the home of this person, but comes from, say, 100 kilometers away. So, what you're seeing there is there's trade going on between groups, and trade implies language. It implies a lessened aggression between groups. So, as cooperation increases and as human aggression is lessened, it's called self-domestication. It's like we domesticated ourselves. Dogs to have domesticated themselves to us. Well, we domesticated ourselves to get along. And so as you progress through history, language, the human groups get larger. You're going to have more, kind of behavioral rules, but these things aren't written down, really codified. And at a certain point in history, humanity is going to cross that threshold where abstract language is invented. And once abstract language is invented, now certain actions can be categorized and put into groups called good acts or evil actions. So, at what point humanity becomes sophisticated enough to really understand the difference and to really speak about the difference and begin to reason about those things. And, I estimate it was about 65, 75,000 years ago. But, to cross that point is something that evolutionary psychologists also recognize, where, first you've got to have theory of mind, which is a fancy way of saying, I know what you're thinking and you're thinking. And that's necessary for develop, and all of those things kind of start to come together around 65, 75,000 years ago. So even if I didn't try to put this in context of Genesis and the story of the fall there, the story that I'm describing in terms of humanity reaching a moral maturity still is factual and is drawn totally from science. So that aspect happened. I'm just simply saying that, the first real instance of morally culpable sin occurred whenever people reached a certain point of maturity and could really reflect on what was happening and think about the fact of what was happening. It happens in the life of a child. A 5-year-old doesn't have the language or the brain development yet for us to put them in jail when they violate the law. But, by the time a child gets to, 10, 11, 12, 13, whatever age it might be, they do cross that boundary line between an adult and a child. So that's just kind of my perspective on evolution, and human evolution is really it's almost just that simple. Of we had to progress from animal to, and morally speaking, the transition period you could compare to childhood, where our brains, our language skills, our reasoning skills, and ability to understand was progressing. Like, for instance, I've mentioned William Lane Craig, and he points to some certain aspects of symbolism that appear early on in the archaeological record. Well, sorry, my dog distracted me for a second. Where I was going with that, let me think. But yeah, I got it now. But the first instance of symbolism is not full symbolism. It's not full humanity. It's comparable to say, a toddler, a 2 or 3-year-old can recognize, this red octagon on the road means stop, or the red light means stop, to go. That's not symbolism. When you process symbols one at a time, it's not symbolism. That would be like, comparing that to modern humans would be like saying, well, the toddler knows what the stop sign means. He's ready to drive. Doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we've kind of been talking about language, and you have a background in English teaching and literature. So let's talk a little bit about like the literary genre of Genesis 1 to 11, for example. You hear a lot of people saying we should just the plain reading of the text. So just is that how we should read it? Like, just hand it a plain reading the text to the 5-year-old, right? Who's just has just learned these words in kindergarten, and just give it to them and say, what's the plain meaning, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. Yeah, it's like as far as the genre, I don't think it's really that difficult of a question, honestly, because I just think that evangelicals, for the most part, just have an allergy to the word myth. Because if you look at the text, it does exactly what a myth does. You can, if you really want to study the, all of the exemplars, examples of that would be, the ancient Near Eastern mythologies that all share a lot in common with early Genesis. You can point to every aspect of Genesis 1 through 11, and there is a mythological comparison that like John mentioned a minute ago about a polemic. That's what I believe Genesis 11 is. It's really a polemic and against ancient Near Eastern, Babylonian and Assyrian, mythologies. So as far as the genre, it's pretty clearly myth, and I only think I think people argue about it only just because they're afraid of saying, well, if it's like Roman or Greek mythology, well, that's all gone by the wayside, and nobody believes that stuff anymore. But that's just the wrong way to look at it. But it's like an example I give. If you handed me a of middle schoolers, and I had a few weeks to teach them about different genres of literature, folk tales and legends and mythology and biography, autobiography, novel, whatever it might be, historical fiction. I mean, not historical fiction, but historical narrative. If they were totally unfamiliar with the story of Genesis, had never heard of Adam and Eve before, and I set down this story before them and say this, and in your plain English translation, with no context, no knowledge of the culture, and said, read this story, tell me what genre it is. I honestly don't think I would get a single one who would say, "Oh, this is history." And if they did, I would probably fail them. That's my angle on it. Like William Lane Craig, for instance, in his book, he took a lot of flack because he labeled it mytho history, and the I he took flack on it mytho, but I would have given him flack for labeling it history, because I don't think you can look at the fact that that it contains genealogies and say, okay, now it's historical, because even the comparison to like the Sumerian king list. The Sumerian king list isn't historical. It's got, the older part of it, I mean.
All right, so just really quick unpack for those who think, oh my goodness, this guy just said the Bible is a myth and it's not true. Is that what you mean?
Oh, I'm sorry, you cut out on me there. I didn't hear your question.
All right, so for those who just heard, this guy thinks the Bible is a myth and it's not true. Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm saying that the Bible is full of all kinds of different genres, and you have to interpret according to genre as one of the starting of how you interpret something. Is it poetry, history? Is it myth? And so, yeah, this early part of Genesis is myth. I personally can make connections between history and early Genesis, which is what I've done with saying that there actually was a historical fall. But if you try to extend that into Genesis 4 and 5 and 6, there is no real connection to the history there. You know, that should be obvious, but it's not. People resist it. So if I say, Adam and Eve and people living for 900 years are myth and not meant to be taken as historical, that doesn't reflect at all on other parts of the Bible. I've heard it claimed, if Adam's a myth, then Jesus must be a myth too. Well, no.
We are running short on time. I'd like to share another quote from one of our viewers, and maybe ask you to delve into a definition based on Kristine's last question to you. But viewer Buddy Spalding asks, any idea what percentage of the evangelical pastorate might be willing to consider non-concordism if someone prominent enough would be brave enough to say it's okay? So I'm going to let you swing at that, Jay. But before I do, I'd like you maybe just to, he used the word concordism. It might be new to some of our viewers. They might not understand what it means, although you've just been talking about, which is the idea kind of that Genesis is narrative history, or that you could find modern science in it, or that it's describing the ancient science it's describing is true. So maybe you can give me your own definition of concordism and then take a swing at Buddy's question there. I'll put it back up for you.
Sure. My own definition of concordism is just simply trying to make every detail in the text match up to historical realities. So, in Genesis 11, Tower of Babel, well, if you're trying to look at that as historical, then you're thinking to yourself, well, at one point in history, everybody spoke one language, and then, God's judgment, and that's where languages come from. Or, in Genesis 1, the old earth folks trying to look at Genesis 1 and say, well, the fact that the light appeared before the sun and moon, or plants were growing before the sun was created, is just reflecting the fact that, well, the earth was very cloudy, couldn't quite see the sun yet. So that is concordism. It's trying to make every detail in the text match some historical reality. With Buddy's question, any idea what percentage might be willing to consider? I don't think that somebody prominent coming out saying it's okay is going to sway any minds at this point, honestly, because even folks like Tim Keller, for instance, will say they don't have a problem with evolution, but he still wants to hold the Romans 5 and say, well, there had to be some kind of historical Adam in there somewhere. You can look at the number of people, like others who have written for Biologos and have done things for Biologos, and have come out and said that they don't have a problem with it. But really, the problem seems to be, with the young Earth creationists. Older people sometimes have a problem with evolution, sometimes don't, but they definitely want to stick to historical Adam. But as far as Buddy's question, I don't have a feeling that if so and so come out and said, hey, it's okay to interpret this way, that suddenly there would be a huge turning of the tide.
If I can just second that by combining your answers to the last two questions, I'd say there was another English lit guy who was pretty prominent named C.S. Lewis, and when he read the Bible,
I've heard
he
of
said
it.
it was clear to him that early Genesis was myth. And when he read the Gospels, he said it was clear to him that these contain eyewitness testimony. He could see the difference. He did think Jonah was also myth, carried the characteristics of myth, and that made him controversial.
As do I.
But as far as prominent people, buddy, C.S. Lewis was pretty prominent. Billy Graham was pretty prominent, and
Yeah.
no one, they were dismissed over their views on non-concordism. And I would just say Franklin Graham recently, who's, by the way, well respected in those circles of evangelical fundamentalist circles, he came out recently, about a year ago, encouraging people to get the vaccine, and he wasn't embraced for his view. He was savaged by the very people who share all his posts. So I think this is so emotionally ingrained. I think this is a generation that has to die in the wilderness. I don't think even God in 40 years in the wilderness of sin will help these people. There will be exceptions. You're looking at one. I'm an exception. But I think it's going to be a rare thing. I think the next generation, the younger generation, doesn't have such a combative relationship with modern science, and I think there's hope there. But as far as the old dogs, I agree with Jay on that. So, Kristine, do you want anything you want to say about that?
I think there's going to be almost like a split or divide that's going to come up, and this is going to be one of those issues that's going to be part of it. Because I see with COVID, there have been a whole bunch of new homeschool families that have arisen that are going to walk down the path of young earth creationism and for a whole new generation. And that could lead to a lot more crisis of faith for those kids as they reach university age. So
It will.
So one concern I have is too often pastors and apologists and youth leaders, they teach that people who accept mainstream science aren't really Christians. I mean, we've experienced that personally. I've been told that. My kids have been told that at church.
I've been called a heretic.
But this means, if that's the message, this means that salvation by grace through faith in Jesus isn't sufficient for salvation. That there's a requirement also for salvation that's how you view biology. And to me, that seems very problematic. And so I want to go tie this all the way back to the beginning of the interview where we were talking about your correlation between this young earth creation and people leaving the faith. So talk about what you see as this correlation and this problem that's facing. I know not all families are young earth creationists. I understand that, but an awful lot of them are. And there are non-homeschool families too.
Right. And and like I said at the beginning, that's really what got me into this whole line of inquiry was, the younger generation, and because that's where my heart is, and that's what I care about. I, like John, I don't have a lot of hope for the people of my generation and even younger coming to a big change of heart here. But it's really the younger people. The problem is they're losing faith because they're being told that they must believe something that is just factually untrue, and that whole mindset extends to all sorts of anti-science positions now, especially in this age of COVID, where the anti-science mindset is literally killing people. And I guess my advice is just it's time for the homeschoolers and parents of young kids, well, parents of kids of any age, really just to, don't push the idea that there's only one way to interpret the Bible. There's only one way to understand this, that science is somehow a giant atheist conspiracy, which is just ludicrous. You might as well believe that the moon landing was faked. So I hope I answered your question, but my feeling is just I think we need to work on the younger generation, and parents of younger kids, or parents of teenagers. Don't give them that one way, has to be this way type of religion, because when you leave them with no way out, and then they discover that what they were taught isn't true, a lot of them do just sneak out the back door and never come back.
Well, and why wouldn't they, right? If you have someone in the pulpit saying, if evolution is true, then Jesus didn't rise from the dead, and then you find out that evolution is true, then where do you
question
go?
Everything.
So, what else did they tell me that's not true?
I would just add to what you both said, and I know you both know this, but just to make it clear for our viewers, I don't think this is necessarily just true of young Earth creationists. I think most Christian apologists are old Earth creationists or Discovery Institute guys, ID guys, and they're extremely anti-evolution. They carry that banner that it's the Bible or evolution. You can't have both. So I think, at least in the Western world here, it's pervasive in American evangelicalism to have that kind of bias, that anti. Now, some will say, well, Reasons to Believe and the Hugh Ross organization, they're not, but they are when they get to the hominins.
They're okay with animal evolution.
Yeah, they're okay with animal evolution.
Only a little bit, not really. They have like that whole grass image where they still say they're separate ancestry.
Yeah, I really do think that the Enlightenment, Kristine, you bring this up a lot, the Enlightenment and the Reformation were a 1-2 blow that was, there were some positive things that came out of the Reformation, but just a 1-2 blow of negativity in this area is how, one of the ways how you approach the Bible changed after the Reformation, and certainly the overreaction to German textual critics and so forth with inerrancy, I think, has really been a perfect storm in the evangelical world. That just truly is now shipwrecking a lot of faith.
It is. It's a whole new conversation there.
Yeah.
Right. So, and yet there was so much good. It's just unfortunate that the level of, I would almost say, English literature ability to read and understand literary passages is part of the problem. And part of the problem is the lack of science education in our country, that people just, have no idea. They can just say something totally wild about science and think it's reasonable.
That's true.
Mm-hmm. So it's a combination of a lot of things.
I don't think they realize that the mountains of evidence that they're arguing against.
No.
Well, I think one of the things that helped me as somebody who lived through what you're talking about I didn't consider the evidence, Jay, until I felt allowed to by meeting other Christians. I thought I was well read on the subject, but I was only reading from within the tribe. It was Francis Collins and the Language of God that helped me overcome my bias towards that mountain of evidence that I would dismiss with kind of what I had learned from my education, which was quite narrow until that time. It wasn't until I never even realized there were Christians who accepted evolution. growing up. I just thought that was just atheists. And so I think part of it for me, and that's one of the reasons we do this show, is to introduce our audience to actual believers, actual Christians who have not only no problem with modern science, but in many cases are help promulgating advances in modern science and sharing an education in it. And so that was very helpful for me. But you know, the evidence, there's a lot of evidence, you know, even about the coronavirus topic. It's just that people are very selective with the evidence. If you share an article and it's not from their tribe, not a tribal approved Fox News or the Wall Street Journal, or if the speaker isn't from Hillsdale College or Liberty University, they're not going to listen, you know, because that person's probably a godless liberal. So
a democrat.
Yes, yeah. So we do have a lot of baggage. So I haven't asked this hard question in a long time, but I might as well ask it because you both kind of teed it up perfectly. Where is the Holy Spirit in all this? If Christians are so behind in so many areas, I mean, I don't see a lot of people searching, raising money in churches to search for the location of Pandora's box. And yet the idea of the early Genesis myth is real in the minds of many people. And the Scopes trial seems like a long time ago, but it still seems like we're dividing up sides based on stuff like that. So, I mean, if we have the mind of Christ, if we have the Holy Spirit and we have these advantages over the natural man, we have the Bible and we have all these great advantages. Why are Christians, why did they drag their feet for a couple hundred years over astronomy? And why are they still dragging their feet over biology? Why is it such like pulling teeth to get our group, our family, who seems like the drunk uncle sometimes, to admit that a mask might be a good thing in a global pandemic and a vaccine might be a good thing?
Yeah. Well, if you're asking, you know, where is the Holy Spirit who we were promised would guide us into all truth when we read the scriptures? You know, I have to go back to the idea that you know, the truth that it's talking about there is you know, saving truth, not truths about the natural world or truths about this is the only valid interpretation of this passage, or you know, the Holy Spirit tells me that Jonah has to have been a real historical figure versus something else. So, you know, I don't see the role. I see the role of the Holy Spirit there as in scripture reading as speaking to the heart and speaking to spiritual truths and spiritual things, not speaking truth about the natural world. Otherwise, you know, like for instance, I saw somebody making a claim on social media the other day that you know, reading the Bible makes you more intelligent. Really? I need to read the Bible more.
Well, I think reading. I think reading makes you more intelligent. Yeah. I mean, if you weren't reading anything ever at all, and you read the Bible, it would make you more intelligent, just because reading opens your mind to be able to think better. You would learn some things. The more you read, you just learn to think better if you read. So there could be a case, possibly.
True.
That's a case for reading. That's a case for reading.
Yeah.
You know, you pulled a
reading anything.
Yeah, you changed the category there, Kristine.
I don't know, but the Bible is full of different genres. I think that's a good thing. There might be maybe a better case that reading the Bible helps you become more intelligent than, say, like a very fiction, or only pop magazine type stuff.
But my medicine chest is filled with medicine too, but it matters very much which bottle you grab for when you're having the heart attack.
Oh,
Yes.
don't push my analogy too far.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. That's fair enough. I always go to Harper Lee
It's
in that
limited.
situation. A Bible in the hands of one man is as dangerous as a bottle of whiskey in the hands of another. A Bible
that's
to
true
me
too.
is a tool, and it could be misused, and many times it's misused.
And has been.
What's
Has
wrong
been.
with? I'm calling for both and there. Bible in
Both
one
in.
hand,
Yeah.
whiskey in the other. Both
Yeah.
and.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, we're kind of running low on time, but we really appreciate your conversation today and the thoughts. Really interesting. I particularly
Fun.
liked
Thank you for
thinking
inviting me.
about how different Adam would be from us if he were like the superhuman person, and how that would completely change the conversation around what would it mean to sin in that situation compared with how we live today. That was really interesting to me.
If my mother was here today, she'd correct you both and let you know that Adam was probably the father of the Syrian people. Because, Assyria is mentioned in Genesis 2. And then, of course, Abraham was an Assyrian. He was from the Ur of the Chaldees, and he's the father of the Jews. So, I mean, God knows how to start a race, how to start a people. But my dear mother...
Never disagree with your mother.
Yes, that's true. Although my father would chime in. He was a pastor, and he'd say, well, look what God says about Assyria. They were more beautiful than Eden, but now they're
dead.
They're dead because they crossed a few wires. But I would like to say one thing, Jay. I really appreciate your view. I think the way you deliver it too is wonderful. I love reading what you do. I hope that you take up the podcast again soon because I really enjoyed your podcast and want to encourage you to do that. It was, as Kristine said, a real blessing to have you on the show today. People can get in touch with you on social media. I know you from Facebook, but becomingadam.com is where you post. Recently, you shared an article with, was it a Lutheran media outlet? And
Lutheran Alliance for Science and Faith, yeah.
Yeah, so again, and we're grateful that you're with your work for BioLogos. So, folks, we encourage you to follow Jay Johnson. He's a gentleman and a scholar. And Kristine, I'll give you the last word.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We appreciate your time and just your support. Thank you so much.
Thank you.